Clara Ara was barely a girl, belly swollen round, when her own mother sold her. Sold her like a sack of corn. It happened in a back room that smelled of sweat and lamp oil, a place so quiet the air felt like glass about to shatter. Her wrists were raw from the iron cuffs. Cuffs her mother, Rosa, had snapped on her an hour before. She sat on the dirt floor, the baby inside her a heavy stone. She kept her eyes down. Looking up meant seeing the truth. An Apache man stood there. His voice was gravel, like stones rolling in a dry riverbed. He wasn't angry, he wasn't kind, he was just tired. A deep, bone-weary tired, like a man who'd been walking for 1,000 years and couldn't set his burden down. "She needs a husband, not a doctor," Rosa said. Her voice was sharp, her eyes fixed on the man. A bargain. That's all her daughter was, a last, desperate bargain. "I don't want a wife," the man said, his gaze on the wall. "I want quiet." But the deal was struck. 2 silver coins, a bottle of liquor that smelled like fire, a promise of half a deer in the autumn. Rosa unlocked the cuffs. She shoved Clara Ara toward the door. "Don't cause trouble," she hissed. "He paid more than you're worth." The man, Kletcher, didn't touch her. He just nodded at his horse. Clara Ara climbed on, her throat tight, her eyes burning. They rode for miles through a land of twisted mesquites and long, whispering shadows. His home was a low adobe house, alone in the middle of nowhere, a place where laughter had died years ago. Inside, it smelled of sage and wood smoke. Clean. Over the fireplace hung a single woven blanket. The colors were faded, but the design was of a woman's hands holding an empty cradle, a dream that never came true. Kletcher pointed to a small room. "You can stay here," he said. "The bed is hard. There's water. I won't enter without warning." Clara Ara said nothing. Her fingers brushed the handle of the small knife she'd sewn into her boot. A secret promise she'd made to herself. A promise that she would never be trapped again. That night, she lay awake, one hand on her belly, the other on the knife. She heard no footsteps. Only the wind and the groaning of the old house. Around midnight, she slipped out of bed, silent on the cold floor. The knife was small, but it was sharp. She stepped onto the porch. A soft rain was falling, and she saw him. Kletcher was kneeling under a lantern, mending a saddle blanket. His hands were steady. He wasn't looking at her. He was talking to the night. "She always said this place needed mending," he murmured. "Not just the walls." Clara Ara froze. The knife in her hand felt heavy as a tombstone. He looked up then, his eyes finding hers in the dark. He saw her standing there, hair plastered to her face by the rain, but all he said was, "You can't sleep." She shook her head, unable to speak. He nodded once, then went back to his stitching. Clara Ara returned to her room and slid the knife under her pillow. Not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the sound of his voice wasn't a threat. It was a wound. An old wound that had never, ever healed. She didn't know it then. But Kletcher hadn't bought a wife. He had brought home a ghost. And he was a man who knew ghosts all too well. The mornings at Kletcher's adobe house began with the smell of cornbread. Clara Ara would wake to a small wooden tray outside her door. A piece of warm bread wrapped in cloth. A cup of chamomile tea. Kletcher was never there, but she'd see him through the window, scattering grain for the chickens, his movements slow, deliberate, each seed a prayer. She would sit on the porch and eat, the simple taste a small anchor in a world that had tried to drown her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt still. One morning, she saw him struggling with a loose post in the corral. She walked out, holding a hammer she'd found. "Do you need this?" He looked up, surprised. Then he nodded. "Pass me those nails." They worked in silence. The sound of the hammer was a steady heartbeat in the vast emptiness. a sound that said, "We are here." "Have you always lived here?" she asked, her voice quiet. He stopped hammering. He looked out at the horizon, at the mountains that stood like sleeping giants. "Since I married," he said. "She wanted a place where the sky was big." Clara Ara looked. The sky was endless. "It is big," she whispered. And for the first time, she noticed the 7 small, smooth stones lined up on a ridge behind the house. 7 stones like markers. But markers for what? That evening, she cooked beans. The smell reminded her of a time before the whiskey, before her mother's hands became hard. Kletcher brought in a rabbit, already cleaned, and laid it by the fire. They ate at the wooden table. The silence was different now, not empty, just quiet. Clara Ara pointed to the blanket on the wall. "It's beautiful." "She made it," he said. His eyes went soft. She loved to weave. Every thread was a story. Clara Ara felt a strange pull. "Tell me one." He looked at her, a long, searching look. Then a tiny spark lit his eyes. "Once," he began, "a coyote tried to steal the moon's light." He told the old story, his voice low and rhythmic. As he spoke, Clara Ara didn't just hear the words. She saw them. She saw the coyote running, chasing a light it could never hold. When he finished, she was smiling. The house didn't feel like a shelter anymore. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like a home. But homes have secrets, and the secrets of this house were buried under 7 small stones on a lonely hill. The days settled into a rhythm. Clara Ara helped Kletcher stack firewood, gather herbs, patch the adobe walls. Her belly grew, and with it, a strange sense of belonging. She was making her mark on this place, but the world outside hadn't forgotten them. One afternoon, a woman named Martyr rode up, her eyes as sharp as thorns. She claimed she was there for eggs, but her gaze cut straight to Clara Ara's belly. "What's this, Kletcher?" she sneered. "Your new pet?" Heat flooded Clara Ara's face. She reached for the knife she now kept in her apron. Kletcher didn't even flinch. He handed Martyr a basket of eggs. "Take them," he said, and quietly closed the door. He didn't defend Clara Ara. He didn't explain. He just went back to carving a piece of wood on the porch. Clara Ara stood frozen in the kitchen, the woman's words ringing in her ears. Pet. She wanted him to say something, anything, to tell her she wasn't a disgrace. But he said nothing. That night she couldn't sleep. She stared at the woven blanket on the wall, at the empty cradle in the design. She finally understood. Kletcher hadn't saved her. He was just as broken as she was. He'd brought her here because he believed this silence, this judgment, was all he deserved. He was living in a tomb of his own making. And she realized something else. Martyr hadn't just been cruel, she had been afraid. But what was she afraid of? It wasn't just a girl with a swollen belly, it was something more. Something to do with Kletcher. Something to do with the 7 graves on the hill. The feeling of being trapped returned, colder than before. Kinder walls, a quieter master. But it was a cage, all the same. She started planning her escape. She saved scraps of bread. She found a few coins she'd hidden from her time at the boarding house. She planned a route north. One afternoon, while Kletcher was hunting, she made her move. She packed a small sack, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out the back door. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The sun was brutal. Her belly ached. Doubt, heavy and suffocating, slowed her steps. Where could she go? Who would help a woman about to give birth? She collapsed under a juniper tree, the sharp scent of the needles filling her lungs. The wind whispered through the branches, a sound like a warning. When she opened her eyes, he was there. Kletcher stood a few feet away, his horse beside him. He wasn't angry. His eyes were just dark, like a coming storm. He pointed back toward the house. "Storm's coming," he said. His voice was flat. "We should go back." She nodded, too exhausted to argue. She walked beside him, clutching her pathetic sack of belongings. He never mentioned it. He never mentioned the knife in her boot. That night, she found an extra blanket folded at the end of her bed. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of cedar. It was an apology he would never speak. She wrapped it around herself and cried, not from fear, but from a confusion so deep it felt like grief. She never tried to run again, but she started watching him more closely. She saw him trace the patterns on Nardi's blanket at night. She saw him talking to the 7 stones on the hill. He wasn't just mourning, he was waiting. One morning, a rider appeared, a cloud of dust on the horizon. Kletcher was splitting wood. He froze, axe in mid-swing. "My brother," he said, and his voice was tight. "Ghost Chi." The man who rode up was weathered and hard. His braids were long, his eyes sharp. He ignored Clara Ara completely. "People talk," Ghost Chi said to his brother, his voice a low growl. "They say you bought a girl, like cattle." Clara Ara stiffened. Kletcher didn't look away. "It's not your concern." "You are Apache," Ghost Chi snapped. "You live out here with ghosts. You bring a stranger into this house, a house of sorrow. It is a disgrace." Kletcher pointed to a row of tiny mesquite saplings he had planted near the corral. They were small but stubborn, clinging to the dry earth. "She is no stranger," he said, "and this place isn't dead." Ghost Chi just shook his head and rode away. That night, Kletcher sat by the fire, whittling. His hands were restless. "Why is he angry?" Clara Ara finally asked. Kletcher sighed. "He thinks I gave up, that I let the sorrow win. He thinks I dishonor them by staying here." He looked at the 7 small carvings on the mantelpiece, a deer, a hawk, a bear, 7 perfect animals, each no bigger than his thumb. He touched one gently. "He's wrong." "You didn't give up," Clara Ara whispered. "You're still planting mesquites." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something other than pain in his eyes. It was a flicker of defiance, a spark in the dark. Weeks later, Ghost Chi returned. He didn't speak. He just got off his horse and started helping Kletcher reinforce the corral. He brought a sack of corn seeds. He brought another blanket. Clara Ara watched from the porch. She was holding her baby, a little girl, born a week earlier in the quiet of the night, with Kletcher's steady hands guiding her into the world. Her cries had filled the silent house. Ghost Chi saw the child. He stopped working. He stared, and the hardness in his face seemed to crack. Just a little. "She's strong," he muttered. Before he left, he placed the blanket he'd brought by the cradle he and Kletcher had spent the day repairing. "For the girl," he said, and rode away. Peace settled over the adobe house. But it was a fragile peace, the calm before the storm, because a new threat was coming, not a ghost from the past, but men who wanted to claim the future. One morning they appeared, a band of settlers, their faces hard, rifles across their saddles. The leader, a man with a ragged beard, didn't dismount. "This is good land, Apache," he said. "We'll take it, sell it to us, and there'll be no trouble." Kletcher stepped onto the porch. The baby, Junipero, was asleep in her cradle just inside the door. "This land is not for sale," Kletcher said, his voice quiet but unbreakable. The man laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "We'll be back." They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence. That night, Clara Ara couldn't sleep. She held the knife, thinking of all the men who take what they want. "I won't let them take this," she whispered to the sleeping baby. The next day, she and Kletcher worked together. They reinforced the corral. They stacked stones near the house. They didn't speak of the settlers. They didn't have to. They were preparing for a war. Clara Ara felt a fire in her own chest now. Not fear. It was rage. This small patch of earth, this quiet house, this broken man, this tiny baby, they were hers. And she would fight for them. She was stacking stones when her hand brushed against Kletcher's. He didn't pull away. For a brief second, his fingers closed around hers, a silent promise. We will face this together. But they had no idea what was coming. The settlers weren't just after the land. Their leader had recognized Kletcher, and he knew the secret of the 7 graves, a secret darker than Clara Ara could ever imagine. The sky turned the color of a bruise. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Clara Ara was inside, rocking Junipero's cradle, when she smelled it. Smoke. She ran to the door. The entire ridge behind the house was on fire. A wall of orange flame, eating the world, and the wind was driving it straight for them. Kletcher burst in, his face grim. "Fire! We have to go!" He grabbed a bucket of water. "The stone shelter! On the north trail!" Clara Ara snatched Junipero from the cradle, wrapping her in a thick blanket. Kletcher soaked another blanket in water and threw it over them both. "Stay behind me!" he yelled over the roar. They ran. The world was an inferno. Ash rained down. Sparks flew like angry insects. The heat was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Kletcher was in front of her, a solid shadow cutting a path through the chaos. They reached the canyon that led to the shelter. It had become a tunnel of fire. "We can't!" Clara Ara screamed. "We have to!" Kletcher grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Don't look! Just run!" Behind them, the adobe house was already catching. The roof timbers groaned. The mesquite saplings she had helped him plant vanished in a flash of flame. Everything they had built was turning to ash. They plunged into the smoke. Clara Ara couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She held Junipero tight against her chest, praying the wet blanket would be enough. The baby was silent, a terrifying, unnatural silence. Just when she thought her lungs would burst, they stumbled into the clearing. The stone shelter was there, built into the side of the hill. Kletcher kicked the door open and shoved them inside, slamming it shut against the firestorm. Inside, it was dark and blessedly cool. The roar of the fire was muffled. Clara Ara collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. She unwrapped the blanket. Junipero was beet red, coughing. But she was alive. She was breathing. Clara Ara hugged her, sobbing with relief. Kletcher lit an oil lamp. His face was black with soot, his shirt singed. He leaned against the stone wall, his chest heaving. "We made it," Clara Ara whispered. He didn't answer. He just slid down the wall, his eyes closing. "Kletcher?" He slumped onto his side and didn't move. "Kletcher!" She scrambled over to him, Junipero in one arm. She put her ear to his chest. His heartbeat was faint, thready. His breathing was shallow. He had inhaled too much smoke. He was dying. "No," she begged. "No, you can't. Stay with me." Junipero started to wail, a sharp, piercing cry that filled the small shelter. It was a cry of life, furious and demanding. Kletcher's chest stuttered. His eyes flickered open. He coughed, a deep rattling sound. He looked at the crying baby, and a faint smile touched his lips. "She's got strong lungs," he rasped. Clara Ara laughed through her tears. "So do you." They were alive. They had lost their home, but they were alive. But the fire was not an accident, and the man who started it was now on his way to the shelter. He thought the fire had done his work for him. He was coming to collect his prize, not the land. Something Kletcher had been protecting for years, something buried beneath the 7th stone. They huddled in the stone shelter for 2 days while the world outside burned. The fire passed, leaving behind a black, smoking landscape. The air was thick with the smell of ash. When Kletcher finally pushed the door open, the devastation was absolute. The adobe house was a ruin of blackened walls. The corral was gone. The mesquites were charcoal sticks. Everything was gone. Clara Ara stood in the doorway, Junipero in her arms, and felt a despair so profound it was like falling. They had survived, but for what? To starve in a wasteland? Kletcher stood beside her, surveying the ruin. He was still weak, his breathing labored, but his eyes were clear. He looked at the blackened earth, then at the sky, then at her. "The earth will heal," he said, his voice rough. "We will rebuild." But how? They had nothing. As if in answer, two figures appeared on the horizon, riding through the smoke. It was Ghost Chi, and he wasn't alone. He had brought men from the camp. They carried tools, sacks of grain, and blankets. Ghost Chi dismounted. He looked at the ruin of his brother's home. He looked at Clara Ara holding her child. He didn't offer condolences. He just nodded at the men he'd brought. "We begin," he said. And so they did. They worked from sunrise to sunset. They cleared the debris. They mixed new adobe bricks from the mud of a nearby creek. The men from the camp worked in a steady, determined rhythm, their shared purpose a silent song against the devastation. Clara Ara worked alongside them, Junipero strapped to her back. She hauled water, mixed mud, and learned to lay the bricks. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and strong. She found she wasn't just rebuilding a house. She was rebuilding herself. Kletcher directed the work, his strength slowly returning. He showed them how to set the beams, how to plaster the walls. He was no longer a man living with ghosts. He was a man building a future. One afternoon, as they were raising the new roof beams, Clara Ara saw something glinting in the ashes of the old fireplace. She dug it out. It was a small carved wooden hawk, blackened by the fire but otherwise intact. One of the 7 carvings from the mantelpiece. She cleaned it and gave it to Kletcher. He held it in his palm, his thumb stroking the smooth wood. His eyes were full of a sorrow she recognized, but it was different now. It was a memory, not a ghost. "Nardi carved these," he said softly. "One for each of them." He looked over at the hill where the 7 stones stood, untouched by the fire. The fire didn't take them. They're still here. Clara Ara finally understood. The carvings, the blanket, the stones. They weren't markers of death. They were anchors of love. But the piece of rebuilding was shattered a week later. The settlers returned. The leader, the man with the ragged beard, rode up to the half-built house. He looked surprised and then angry to see them alive. "Still here, Apache?" he sneered. "Thought a little fire might convince you to leave." Kletcher stepped forward. Ghost Chi and the other men stood behind him, their hands on their knives. "This is my land," Kletcher said. The man laughed. "Not for long." He pointed a long, dirty finger at Kletcher. "I know who you are. I know what you did. I know what's buried up on that hill." A cold dread washed over Clara Ara. "7 graves," the man said, his voice dripping with venom. 7 children, all dead from the fever you brought from the reservation. You carry a curse, Apache. This land is tainted because of you." He looked at his men. "And we're here to cleanse it." So that was it. The fear in Martyr's eyes, the whispers. They didn't just think he was broken. They thought he was poison. "You're wrong," Clara Ara said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped up beside Kletcher. "There is no curse here." The man just smiled, a cruel, ugly twisting of his lips. "We'll see about that." He turned his horse. "We'll be back, and when we come back, we're taking it all." As they rode away, Clara Ara looked at Kletcher. The old weariness was back in his eyes, the weight he carried. The settlers hadn't just burned his house, they had tried to burn his spirit. That night, a terrible quiet fell over the camp. The work stopped. Ghost Chi argued with Kletcher in low, urgent tones. He wanted to fight. Kletcher refused. "Violence will not heal this," he insisted. Clara Ara knew Kletcher was right, but she also knew the settlers would not be stopped with words. She went to the hill. She stood before the 7 stones. For the first time, she saw them not as graves, but as guardians. She knelt and placed her hand on the 7th stone, the smallest one. and her fingers brushed against something carved into the rock, hidden beneath a patch of lichen. It wasn't a number. It was a symbol. A coiled serpent. A symbol she recognized. She had seen it before. Long ago. A tattoo on the back of a man's hand. The hand of Javier, the boy who had left her with a baby and a broken heart. The ground seemed to fall away beneath her. Javier wasn't just a boy who hauled firewood. The settlers weren't just after land, and the seventh grave on the hill was not what it seemed. It was a lie Kletcher had been living with for years, and it was about to be uncovered. Clara Ara's mind reeled. Javier, the serpent tattoo, the seventh stone. It didn't make sense. She ran back to the half-built house. Kletcher was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Ghost Chi was gone. "The seventh stone," she said, her voice breathless. "There's a carving on it, a snake." Kletcher didn't look at her. His face was a mask of stone. "You should not have gone there." "I saw that mark before," she pushed, her heart pounding. "On Javier, the father of my child. What does it mean, Kletcher? What are you hiding?" He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, dead. "The seventh child was not mine," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. "When the fever came," he went on, "it took 6 of them, one by one. Nardi. She broke. The grief was a madness. She left. She went to the mining camp. She was looking for anything to numb the pain. She came back, changed. Months later, she gave birth. A boy. He was not mine. He was sick from the moment he was born. He didn't live a day." Clara Ara felt the air leave her lungs. "Nardi died that night," Kletcher whispered. "She made me promise to bury the boy with our children, to protect him, to never speak his father's name." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of an agony so deep it was bottomless. "His father was a boy from the camp, a boy with a serpent tattoo. He sold my Nardi whiskey and lies." Javier. It all crashed down on her. Javier hadn't just abandoned her. He had a history of preying on broken women, and the leader of the settlers. What was his connection? "The leader," Kletcher said, as if reading her mind. "His name is Marcus. Javier was his younger brother. Twist after twist. The world was a knot she couldn't untangle." "Marcus doesn't want the land," Kletcher explained, his voice flat. "He thinks I killed Javier. Javier disappeared around the same time Nardi died. Marcus believes I took my revenge and buried him in that grave. He thinks there's proof there, something of Javier's. He started the fire to clear the land, to make it easier to dig. Justice. It wasn't about land. It was about a twisted, mistaken vengeance." "But Javier just left," Clara Ara said, confused. "He left me a note." Kletcher shook his head slowly. "Did he?" He stood up and went to a small wooden chest that had survived the fire. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It wasn't a note. It was a land deed, a deed to this very property, signed over to Nardi. And at the bottom, another signature. A witness. Rosa. Her mother. "Your mother found out about Nardi," Kletcher said grimly. "She found out Javier had promised Nardi this land. She confronted him. She didn't want him running off with some Apache woman when she could sell you to me for a profit. She told him to disappear, or she would tell Marcus about his child, the one he had with Nardi. Marcus is a proud man, a violent man. He would not have taken kindly to the shame of an Apache half-breed in his family." Her own mother. She hadn't just sold her. She had orchestrated this whole nightmare. She had manipulated everyone, destroyed lives, all for 2 silver coins and a bottle of liquor. The evil wasn't a curse. It was human greed. Suddenly a shout came from outside. "They're coming!" Clara Ara ran to the doorway. Torches were moving through the darkness, a dozen of them. Marcus and his men were back, and this time, they had shovels. They weren't coming for a fight. They were coming to desecrate a grave. Ghostchi and the men from the camp stood ready, knives drawn. But Kletcher held up a hand. "No," he said. "No more blood on this land." He walked out into the torchlight, unarmed. Clara Ara watched, her heart in her throat. "You want to dig, Marcus?" Kletcher called out, his voice ringing with a strength she had never heard before. "Then dig. Uncover the truth." Marcus hesitated, surprised. Then he sneered and motioned to his men. "Dig up the seventh grave." His men swarmed the hill. Clara Ara clutched Junipero, her knuckles white. This was it, the final confrontation, not of knives, but of secrets. The men dug. The sound of shovels hitting rock echoed in the night. Finally, they pulled a small wooden box from the earth. Marcus ripped it open. He plunged his hand inside, expecting to find a man's bones, a belt buckle, a knife. He pulled out a tiny, woven blanket and a single fire-blackened wooden hawk, the remains of an infant. Confusion, then rage, twisted Marcus's face. "Where is he? Where did you bury my brother?" "Your brother is gone," Kletcher said. "He ran from his own choices. There is nothing for you here but the ghosts of your own making." But Marcus wouldn't accept it. He drew his pistol, his eyes wild. "Liar!" "It's the truth," a voice cut through the tension. Everyone turned. A lone figure was walking into the torchlight. A figure Clara Ara knew all too well. It was her mother, Rosa. "I told him to run," Rosa said, her voice slurring slightly, a bottle clutched in her hand. "He was no good. Bad blood." She looked from Marcus to Kletcher, a strange, triumphant gleam in her eyes. "You're all fools, fighting over dirt and ghosts." Marcus stared at her, then at the box, then at Kletcher. The lie he had built his hatred on was crumbling. He looked lost, his rage turning to empty confusion. His men lowered their shovels, shuffling awkwardly. Clara Ara stepped forward, her voice clear and cold. "You did this," she said to her mother. "All of this. For nothing." Rosa just laughed, a broken, empty sound. "I did what I had to do to survive, just like you." "No," Clara Ara said. She looked at Kletcher, at Ghostchi, at the half-built house behind her. "I'm not like you. I don't survive by selling pieces of my soul. I survive by building." She turned her back on her mother and walked back toward the house. Kletcher followed her. One by one, Marcus's men turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the darkness with a broken woman and an open grave. The war was over. A year later, the adobe house was alive again. The walls stood strong, plastered smooth. Green vines climbed the new corral posts. The mesquite saplings Kletcher had planted had survived. New green shoots pushed up from the blackened roots. They were scarred, but they were growing. Junipero, now a toddler, chased chickens in the yard, her laughter echoing in the clear air. The community had healed. Neighbors who had once whispered about curses now brought gifts of cornbread and jam. Martyr's son, Miguelito, came often to listen to Kletcher's stories of Coyote and the moon. He told them not with sorrow, but with a twinkle in his eye. The settlers, their lie exposed, had moved on. Marcus was gone. No one knew where. Rosa was last seen walking the dusty road toward the next mining camp, a ghost chasing a bottle. Clara felt no hatred for her anymore, only a distant, sad pity. One evening, Clara and Kletcher sat on the new porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. Junipero slept peacefully inside. Ghostchi was there, sharing a quiet meal with them. He had become a regular visitor, his presence a comforting warmth. Clara was reading from a book, her voice soft in the twilight. She looked up at Kletcher, at the lines of peace that had settled around his eyes. She looked at the 7 new carvings he had placed on the mantel. Not replicas of the old ones. These were different. A mockingbird, a blooming cactus, a running child. Symbols of life. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked at her. "For what?" "For rebuilding," she said. He reached over and his hand covered hers on the bench. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of something deeper. Partnership. Family. We rebuilt, he corrected her gently. She smiled. The silence between them was no longer a space of grief. It was a space of peace, a space where new things could grow. They had faced down ghosts, fires, and the hatred of men. They had taken a place of sorrow and made it a home. They had learned that some things must be lost for miracles to take root. That even in the deepest ashes, life can find a way to bloom. What do you think makes a family? Is it blood? Or is it the bonds we forge in the fire? If you enjoyed this story of survival and found family, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that dig up the truth.